Hey everybody, hope you're having a good day today. This presentation is on the Student Life paper for UBI, which I was assigned. So the Student Life paper was published through Dartmouth College. For those of you that don't know what Dartmouth is, it's a member of the Ivy League. These are the top tier universities in the United States. It's ranked number 43 in the nation for graduate computer science through the US News and World Report rankings that are cited by everybody. There were 9 authors, I believe. 4 of them were Dartmouth students who are now either in industry or a professor somewhere else. 3 of them were Dartmouth professors, and then there were also students from the University of Texas and Northeastern University. So another inter-college paper, which is pretty cool. The conference was UBI Comp 14. This is a conference for both ubiquitous and pervasive computing. They used to be 2 separate conferences, but now they merged together. This paper is very well cited. It had almost 600 citations on Google Scholar, which is pretty cool. So the basis behind this paper, a lot of you have experienced this yourself. A lot of factors contribute to our performance over the semester. You have things like stress, mood, sleep, what you're eating, time management, all this kind of stuff. And some of these factors are easier to see, particularly by faculty, than others. And so given similar situations, some students succeed and some students fail. And the question the paper is asking is why? What factors can we identify that will tell you how well a student does? And how can we measure these factors in such a way that school officials can understand them and maybe do something about it? Their solution is called Student Life. It's an act which tracks your daily activities and measures them as indicators of success. It measures things like mental health, academic performance, and behavioral trends is the things that they're looking for in the paper. This can indicate to a student and to university staff when the student is on track to do well or when they're doing poorly and maybe the student either needs to self-correct or the faculty needs to intervene. They did a really good job with their related work in this paper. They identified some specific research areas that they were interested in. One of them is smartphones and measuring behavioral health. They did talk about an MIT study that does what's called reality mining, where they studied social behavior through phone data. For the other 2 areas, these mental health studies and the health and performance of students, they showed that there were some self-assessment experiments, and then also some people tried some wearable sensors, but they did identify that nobody else had really tried to do this with smartphones, which is their target area. So they really identified themselves as a necessary paper, which I thought was really good. So on to the experiments. For the study design, there were 48 participants, all of whom were in a smartphone programming class at Dartmouth. They were both undergrads and grad students. 38 of them were male and 10 were female. So a little bit lopsided, but as is the rest of computer science. The experiment only used Android phones. And this was an interesting point because some of the users or some of the participants in the experiment were iPhone users. So those users were given an Android phone to carry for the experiment. The study does distinguish these as primary and secondary users because some of the people were having to carry around 2 phones all day, but they were able to mitigate that, as we'll explore later on. So the procedure took 2 primary forms of data. There's this automatic sensing data and periodic surveys. So if you look at this cool little diagram over here, they used a number of instruments in the phone in order to collect data. So they used the accelerometer to be able to tell what kind of activities the student were performing. They used the microphone to look more at conversation. They used the light sensor and the GPS and Bluetooth to see whereabouts the student was. They also they were able to pretty accurately measure where the student was sleeping. It's really cool the amount of stuff they were able to do while also preserving the student's privacy, which I thought was pretty neat. They had specific filters applied to the conversation where they could measure what was going on locally without needing to upload stuff. They specifically disassociated students' data from the personal identifying data from the students' activity data. They did some really cool stuff with that. And they also did surveys. So throughout the day, usually, I think they said an average about 8 times a day, they would send out these ecological momentary assessments, or EMAs. And so if you look down here, you can see kind of what those look like. It started with a PAM, which is basically this group of images where the student was asked to pick one to describe how they felt. And then they could talk about different things. This one's a stress EMA. So they could say they're a little stressed or they're really, really stressed, or they're just doing okay, pretty good. So there were those that were sent out day. And so they took the combination of these automatic measures and these self-reports, threw them into the cloud, and were able to get some statistical analysis out of them. They did some cool things to get students to respond. They not only gave incentives, so I think they gave the top 10 people were put into drawings for some kind of prize halfway through, and there were some again at the end. But they are also monitoring inactivity. So when a student forgot their phone in their room all day or something like that, they had monitoring procedures in place to be able to identify those and then email a student, hey, make sure you take your phone with you. So let's look at the results they were able to achieve. The first thing we look at was this PHQ-9 depression scale. This is an established depression scale, which is one of the really cool things they did in that they used a lot of times existing scales instead of trying to make up their own scales. If you look at these, they took both survey results on this and they took dynamic collection. So here are the surveys they took over the semester. You notice that you had a lot of students who had minimal or minor depression with a couple up from moderately severe and severe, and those numbers increased here over the end of the semester. So that was an interesting result. With the automatic sensing data, you'll notice that a lot of these are fairly low p-values. With a p-value, you're really looking for 0.5 or 0.05 or less. 0.01 is amazing. But as long as you're below 0.05, you're pretty statistically significant. All of these are pretty statistically significant, and all of them are negatively correlated. So you'll notice that the more sleep you're getting, the less likely you are to be depressed. And then the more you're talking throughout the day, the less likely you are to be depressed, and so on and so forth. Those negative R constants there. You have some other factors in place here. You'll notice that loneliness correlates negatively with being active, kind of moving a lot throughout the day, and moving about both indoors and outdoors. You also have this perceived stress scale. You'll notice that some of these values aren't super great. So this activity duration during the day wasn't super great, but a lot of these are pretty good values. They were able to get some very statistically significant results with this experiment, which I thought was really cool. And they also looked at flourishing, which is basically how well are you able to succeed greatly. And you notice they correlated that with conversation duration and got some interesting results, not super great. The really interesting thing here is academic performance. They were able to correlate these factors very well with how well both their spring GPAs were and their overall GPAs were. So you'll notice that it correlated positively with how long their conversations were. So longer conversations throughout the day generally resulted in higher GPA. You'll notice that if they were moving around a lot, they had a little bit less GPA. And so these are some pretty interesting results that they were able to get. The last thing that they talked about, which I thought was really, really cool, was this Dartmouth term life cycle. So what they did is they averaged out all of the students' values over the semester, and they were able to identify these trends that went on during the semester. So you notice looking here at the EMA and sleep data, you see this stress line kind of starting very low here and then increasing over the form of the semester. And I think we've all kind of experienced this ourselves. You'll notice positive affect. People are getting less and less positive over the semester. Sleep duration. Sleep is kind of all over the place. So you notice that sharp little spike down there at the end of the semester. Hashtag finals week. And you can see the deadlines correlating with those. You also see the deadlines over here correlating with activity duration, conversation duration, and conversation frequency. Notice the conversation frequency starts to go up, as does the conversation duration, kind of towards the end of the semester here. And then over here, you got your location-based data. You'll notice that students are spending less and less time inside their dorms, and they're actually going to class less and less and less as you go through the semester. They hypothesized that this was due to students skipping class maybe to focus and self-study a little bit more in order to finish their assignments. Or at least they hypothesized a little bit. I added a little bit onto that because I think a lot of us have experienced that. This was a very good paper. I really liked this paper. It had good experimental design. It used established scales and methods like I talked about. They did a lot of really cool things. One of my favorite parts was at the end of the paper where they identified some students who would have failed out of Dartmouth if not for this experiment, because the faculty were able to see that they were struggling in these areas and actually gave them incompletes in order to finish the work during the summer, as opposed to their faculty or their professors in other classes who ended up failing them in those classes. And if they had not failed out of this class too, they would have failed out of Dartmouth. So this has the potential to have a lot of really good impact as the professors get a better window into what their students are going through. The paper did feel a little dry and disjointed in some places. They didn't do a great job of telling a story with the paper. They just kind of put a section here, put a section here. They didn't really introduce any hypotheses. They didn't really introduce kind of the history behind the paper. They just kind of plopped right into the experiment, which I didn't think was super great. They also combined the results of the discussion section. This didn't really affect the Dartmouth term life cycle discussion. I thought that was really good. But with the other tables that I went through, they just kind of said it and then said a sentence about each of them and then go in. There wasn't a separate discussion, which I thought would have really helped the paper. But if you're interested in this project, it actually, from what I can tell, hopefully is still going. There haven't been any papers published on it in a while, but you can go to this website and look at it, and the data is all available open source online, minus personal identifiers, of course. But you can go play with it yourself and see what you can do. That's all I've got. Hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.